At 8:45 in the morning on January 20th, 1953, a limousine sat motionless outside the White House. Inside that car was Dwight David Eisenhower, the most decorated general in American history, the man who'd just been elected president in a landslide. The temperature was 49 degrees. The sky hung gray and heavy, and Eisenhower refused to move. He would not step out of that car. He would not walk through the door. He would not enter the building where Harry Truman waited. Inside the White House, the sitting president stood at the window, staring down at the car that wouldn't budge. This wasn't a scheduling mix-up. This wasn't about protocol. This was a deliberate, calculated insult delivered on what should have been one of democracy's most dignified moments. The man refusing to leave that car was 62 years old, Supreme Allied Commander of World War II, the victor of Europe. Eisenhower had accepted Nazi Germany's surrender. He'd commanded millions of men across two continents. The American people had just handed him 55% of the popular vote and a crushing 442 electoral votes. But on this frozen January morning, he wouldn't walk 20 feet to shake hands with the man who'd offered him everything. Inside that White House stood Harry Truman, 68 years old, the farmer from Missouri who'd made the call to drop atomic bombs on Japan. He'd confronted Stalin. He'd launched the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe. He'd fired Douglas MacArthur at the height of his popularity. And 7 years earlier, Truman had done something almost unthinkable. He'd offered to make Eisenhower president, with Truman himself stepping down to become vice president. Eisenhower had said no. He claimed he had no interest in politics whatsoever. The relationship between these two men hadn't always been shattered. In July 1945, President Truman met General Eisenhower in Germany, driving together through Berlin's ruins. Truman looked at the young general and said something extraordinary. "General, there is nothing you may want that I won't try to help you get. That includes the presidency itself." Eisenhower thanked him and declined. He was a soldier, not a politician. Truman didn't give up. In 1947, he made the offer again, writing it in his private diary. He proposed that if Douglas MacArthur ran as a Republican, Eisenhower should announce for the Democratic nomination. Truman wrote he'd gladly step aside and become Eisenhower's vice president. Once again, Eisenhower said no. The years rolled forward. Their relationship was professional, respectful, productive. Then 1952 arrived, and everything Eisenhower had said for 7 years turned out to be a lie. Eisenhower announced he would seek the Republican nomination for president. Truman felt personally stabbed in the back. But political differences alone didn't destroy their relationship. What Truman couldn't accept was what Eisenhower did to George Marshall. Marshall had transformed the United States Army from fewer than 200,000 men into a fighting force of over 8 million during World War II. In 1941, Eisenhower was an unknown lieutenant colonel. Marshall saw potential in him and promoted him rapidly, jumping him over hundreds of more senior officers. By 1943, Marshall recommended him to lead D-Day. Marshall had wanted that command for himself, but handed it to Eisenhower instead. Without Marshall, Eisenhower's career wouldn't exist. After the war, Marshall served as Truman's Secretary of State, creating the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Western Europe. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1953, the only career military officer ever to receive that honor. Starting in 1950, Senator Joseph McCarthy rode anti-communist hysteria like a wave. He accused Marshall of being part of a communist conspiracy. In a Senate floor speech in June 1951, McCarthy spent 60,000 words attacking Marshall. He called Marshall's career a conspiracy so immense and an infamy so black as to dwarf any previous venture in the history of man. The accusations were insane. Marshall had built the army that crushed Nazi Germany. He'd created the Marshall Plan that stopped communist expansion in Europe. Senator William Jenner went even further, calling Marshall a frontman for traitors. Truman was enraged. He expected Eisenhower to defend Marshall. The man owed Marshall everything. In October 1952, Eisenhower was scheduled to speak in Milwaukee, McCarthy's home state. His staff prepared a speech that included one short paragraph defending Marshall. The paragraph was clear and direct, praising Marshall's dedication and patriotism. It was released to reporters in advance. Political observers anticipated a powerful moment. But then Wisconsin Governor Walter Kohler Jr. and campaign staff urged Eisenhower to cut the paragraph. They argued it would offend McCarthy and Wisconsin Republicans. Eisenhower needed Wisconsin's electoral votes. Why pick a fight over something that wouldn't change any votes? Eisenhower made the calculation. Winning mattered more than defending Marshall. On October 3, 1952, Eisenhower stood on stage at the Milwaukee Arena with McCarthy beside him. He delivered his speech, praising McCarthy's anti-communist efforts. He said absolutely nothing about George Marshall, not one word. After the speech, McCarthy grabbed Eisenhower's hand and thrust it high in the air like a referee raising a boxer's arm. The cameras flashed. The photograph went out across America. Dwight Eisenhower, hero of D-Day, shaking hands with the man who'd called his mentor a traitor. The news coverage was brutal. Reporters knew Eisenhower had planned to defend Marshall because the paragraph was in the advance text. This was a deliberate choice. Truman's reaction was immediate. I had never thought the man, who is now the Republican candidate, would stoop so low. He called it one of the most shocking things in the history of this country, he said. The trouble with Eisenhower, he's just a coward. 2 weeks before Milwaukee, Eisenhower had campaigned in Indianapolis with Senator Jenner, the man who'd called Marshall a frontman for traitors. Eisenhower appeared on stage with Jenner, let him embrace him, smiled for the cameras. For Truman, this revealed something fundamental about Eisenhower's character. He'd sacrifice principle for votes. He'd abandon loyalty for electoral advantage. If Eisenhower couldn't stand up to McCarthy and Jenner during a campaign, how could he stand up to the Soviets? The campaign got worse from there. By election day, the personal animosity was impossible to hide. Eisenhower won in a landslide. After the election, they met once on November 18, 1952 for a transition briefing. The atmosphere was stiff, formal, embarrassing. Neither wanted to be there. Truman tried briefing Eisenhower on how the White House functioned. Eisenhower listened with visible impatience. He'd commanded millions. He didn't need Harry Truman lecturing him about running an organization. Eisenhower later wrote, the meeting added little to my knowledge. By Inauguration Day, the tension was visible to everyone. Eisenhower made his decision. He would not enter the White House. He'd stay in the limousine and make Truman come to him. Inside the White House, Truman saw the car sitting outside. He knew Eisenhower wasn't coming. He swallowed his anger and walked outside. Truman opened the door and climbed into the back seat. The two men sat beside each other. They didn't look at each other. They didn't speak. The silence was suffocating. At some point during the drive, Eisenhower broke the silence. He asked who had ordered his son John back from Korea for the inauguration. Truman said, I did. The president thought it was right and proper for your son to witness the swearing in of his father. It was a generous gesture. Truman had used his authority as commander-in-chief to make sure John could be there. Despite his anger, Truman still believed some things mattered more than politics. Eisenhower said nothing in response, no thank you, no acknowledgement. He just turned back to looking out the window. They arrived at the Capitol. Eisenhower became the 34th president. When it ended, Truman left Washington. He would not return to the White House for 10 years. For 8 years, from 1953 to 1961, Truman never set foot there. The two men lived in frozen hostility. Then in October 1959, George Marshall died. Both attended his funeral, sitting in the same pew for the first time in 6 years and 9 months. They didn't speak. Over the next 4 years, they saw each other at other funerals, maintaining their distance. Then in November 1963, President Kennedy was killed in Dallas. Truman and Eisenhower rode together to Arlington Cemetery. They actually talked, discussing whether it was conspiracy or lone gunmen. After the service, Margaret Truman invited the Eisenhowers for lunch at Blair House. For an hour, they talked like two old men who'd once known each other well. When it was time to leave, they stood on the sidewalk. Then they shook hands. It was long, lingering, silent. 10 years after that cold January morning, they'd finally found their way back. The story became part of American political lore. The refusal to enter the White House was about betrayal. Both men had legitimate grievances. Both let those grievances override their responsibility to the moment. Eisenhower forgot that when he refused to walk through the door. Truman remembered it when he walked out anyway. The handshake in 1963 suggests they understood what they'd lost. But understanding came too late to change what happened on that cold January morning in 1953.